Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Pleased to be joined this week by a familiar guest. First time he has been on with us this season, but always enjoy our conversations. Mike DeCourcy of the Sporting News, Big Ten Network, and I believe he's also a bracketologist. So, Mike, you've got a lot of titles now. Welcome back to the show. Been a fun college basketball season, and we're excited to talk to you about some Indiana basketball today.
I'm looking forward to it. Absolutely, Alex. It's great to talk to you again.
So let's start. Let's get this out of the way. You've covered this sport for a long time. You've seen a lot of different situations transpire. What was your reaction when you heard the news the other night that Indiana was going to play the game at Northwestern without 5 scholarship players and that they had been suspended? Announced. There'd been some speculation that afternoon that maybe something was going to happen, but Mike Woodson makes the announcement about 30 minutes before tip on his radio interview with Don Fisher before the game, and the Hoosiers go into Northwestern and lose by 8 points without 5 scholarship players.
I can say that, I've been doing this now at Sporting News for 27 years. Covering college basketball full time for about 35. And I can't remember a short-term suspension that consumed half a team during the season. I think maybe even Indiana, after that one circumstance around Midnight Madness, might have had that, around as many players, but I don't think they ended up all missing a game. And if any of them missed games, it was early, and I don't think it was a league, a conference type deal where you're playing a key conference game. So I can't remember that this large a percentage of players being suspended for something that appears to be short term. One game is what seems to be the case. So a very unusual circumstance in that regard. And I went in on Sunday night on Big Ten Basketball and Beyond and said that I thought this game was essential for the Hoosiers. I don't consider it a must win because you can't make up for it. There's so many opportunities to make up for it if you don't. But to make up for losing that game, you have to do something that you're not expected to do, not likely to do. Not that it's impossible. Beating Michigan State on the road or beating Ohio State on the road are not impossible, certainly. But it's not something you're expected to do, and it's going to be difficult. And you probably could have gotten away with losing both of those if you could pull off home Wisconsin. That you probably could have gotten away with them and been in the heart of the field, somewhere in the 7-9 range, 7-10. But now if you don't take care of Wisconsin, you put yourself in jeopardy. People always look micro and say, well, if my team doesn't do this, they're going to be out, and never consider, well, there's like 30 other my teams out there that are pretty likely to do as many things disappointing as yours might. But they didn't have a game that was winnable, that was also losable, and have 5 players miss that game because of a team violation suspension. And so that's something that Indiana put on itself, that now it's going to take something special to recover from it.
So this game obviously was important for Indiana, but it was also a quad 1 game. So it doesn't necessarily hurt their resume, but it could have boosted it significantly from a bracketology perspective and kind of what's coming up. They've got 7 regular season games left, and they've got 7 Big Ten wins. Do you think, and obviously there's a lot of contingencies here with everything in terms of what happens in other leagues, what kind of bid stealing and all that, and what happens with other Big Ten teams. But do you think this is a situation where Indiana is going to need to get to 500 or so in the Big Ten to put themselves in position to make the tournament? Or are they going to have to be better than that to feel comfortable about their chances?
Okay, so first off, their record now in the league is they're Their record is 7-6. So in order to be below 500, okay, so let's say they went 0-3 in the next stretch. So then they're 7-9. But then they have Maryland, Minnesota, Rutgers. They're back above 500, and then they have Purdue. So if they just did what was expected of them, they would finish 500. Lose to all the obvious terrific teams, lose to the teams that or win against the teams that are either in your weight class or slightly below. I don't think that I think they need to be 500 only because what 500 entails. The 500 record isn't magical, and under 500 isn't fatal. But because of what it would take for you to finish under 500, which is basically, if I'm doing the math correctly, you're going to have to either lose Maryland, Minnesota, or Rutgers. That's what gets you, not necessarily being under 500, but losing another non-tournament team, losing to another non-tournament team, missing 4 opportunities to get another high quality victim. That's what puts you in some jeopardy. And again, it still doesn't necessarily mean they won't be in there. But what you have to remember about the Hoosiers resume is that, it's built on a pretty lean foundation. That foundation is overall success and a Purdue win and good metrics. Those are the 3 things which are not, they matter, but they're not everything. What really would be helpful is for them to get another high quality win. And obviously, given that 3 of your 4 opportunities are on the road, the one that you would really have to circle is kind of a essential win, somewhat in the same way Northwestern was, but maybe even more so, is the Wisconsin game coming up on Tuesday.
In terms of Indiana's play on the court this season, I haven't had really a chance to talk to you this season at all. I'm curious what your observations have been of Indiana on both ends of the court. I know you don't watch every game, but offensively, you look at their numbers. They're ranked outside of the top 100 right now in Ken Palm's adjusted offensive efficiency. I think that's worse than they ever were under Archie Miller. Defensively, though, they're 15th in the country, adjusted defensive efficiency in Ken Palm. I think they have the best defense in conference play in the Big Ten, which is no small feat given the quality of the teams at the top of the league. Have you been surprised at all how much they've struggled offensively, and how much do you think that's a product of the personnel that they have? And defensively, how much have they impressed you with what Woodson's been able to do in his first season?
Well, on the defensive end, they impressed me because of how they're constructed relative to the league. They play a 6'9" center in a league that has 2 All-America level 7-footers in Hunter Dickinson and Kofi Coburn. And then 2 All-America level, although they're splitting time, maybe you consider it 1 All-America level center split 2 ways at Purdue that they have to deal with, one of whom is 7'5". So to be able to be as proficient defensively as they have been, given that they are significantly smaller in the front court than most of their opponents, given that they're not overly dynamic on the wings. I mean, Miller Kopp and Parker Stewart are very good college players and unbelievable. They're terrific shooters, but neither is an electrically dynamic player like Jaden Ivey or anyone close to him. So to be able to be as proficient defensively as they have been has been very impressive. Offensively, I'm surprised the number is as low as it is, because when I look at them, I don't see a team that functions badly on offense. There are situations where they don't flow, obviously, and some of that is personnel based. And again, some of that is having to put Trace up against such overwhelming size. It's the same issue he had a year ago and the year before that. The Big Ten has been annually loaded with terrific big guys, and that's not going away. I think there are times when partly, I think when you talk about personnel, I think Xavier Johnson, when he's been on the floor, has played above what I thought his station would be. But at the same time, he has limitations, and especially in terms of operating a high quality winning offense. It's not something he has a ton of experience doing. I think he's superseded that in a lot of ways, but there still are games when it doesn't happen the way it should. I look at the Illinois game as an example of that. I believe in that game, Miller had 0 3-point attempts and Parker was 2 for 4, something like that. That ball needed to find those guys more. You weren't beating Illinois with your 2 best shooters going a combined 2 of 4. You had to have some potency from the 3-point line to beat a team that good, whether it's in your gym, in your backyard, or wherever. You had to have more from your best 3-point shooters, and they didn't get it. So I think there are times when they don't flow to the direction that they need to. But I have to admit, when I see their offense, it doesn't look like as much work as the numbers suggest.
Our friends at Homefield produce the world's most comfortable premium licensed collegiate apparel out of their headquarters in Indianapolis. Run by IU grads, Homefield studies Indiana's history to come up with the most unique apparel designs available for Hoosier fans anywhere. Our current favorites at Podcast on the Brink are the 1987 National Champs t-shirt commemorating IU's last national championship and the vintage 1965 Indiana University Bison t-shirt. And it's not just Indiana apparel available at Homefield. They're constantly adding new schools to the over 120 currently available at homefieldapparel.com. Podcast on the Brink listeners can save 15% off of your first purchase by using code BRINK15 during checkout at homefieldapparel.com. When you look at how they've continued to, when they've had everybody available, play Stewart and Kopp together in the starting lineup, when they have an option like Trey Galloway off the bench, or even a Tamar Bates, who at times, and maybe, he's a 5-star recruit and can create a shot a little bit on his own. Do you think there's an argument to be made switching that up in terms of having another guy on the wing that can actually maybe go off the dribble and try to create something like a Trey Galloway, or even Bates a little bit more aggressive? Because to me, what I see in a lot of games is Xavier Johnson can create, a little bit for himself and does spread the ball around relatively well when you look at his assist rate. But Kopp and Stewart are highly dependent on other guys to create opportunities for them. And when we get in late shot clock situations, things break down. Those guys aren't really going to be an option to go get a bucket. So I'm just curious what you think about switching that up in terms of maybe giving Galloway a bigger role, or Tamar Bates, or what is there no better option than what they've done so far with Stewart Kopp?
No, I think Trey, first of all, when Trey had to play nearly 40 minutes of point guard, he showed you how well he can move the basketball. If you hadn't already seen it when the ball was in his hands periodically, which he did very well with that, in those circumstances. I compared him, whether it was this past week's show or the show before, I compared him to like a soccer midfielder where you don't get a lot of stats because you're in the middle of it, but the ball going from the defense to the front line, the ball goes through you, and if it doesn't go fluidly through you, then the play doesn't work. And it's like that with him on a basketball floor. The ball flows through him and it goes where it needs to go, and it's something that it's really good in transition, and I think it's an option in half court as well. It does change the way the defense plays you because he's not a potent 3-point shooter, but he's not dismal. 30% is not great. Obviously, it's not what you're looking for, and he doesn't take a lot of attempts. But at least you kind of have to. You can't, if you want to walk away from him, you're taking a risk. So I think you kind of have to guard him, and I do think that's something that they could use more often, especially when because otherwise you're putting so much on Xavier. He has to do everything in terms of creating offense, except for when the ball finds the post, which is, usually it would come from him. And when the ball finds the post, Trace has become very good at distributing it. And that's part of why they like to play the two shooters, is because Trace has gotten good enough at it that when the ball comes out to his side, there's a shooter. When the ball comes out when he has the option to go to the opposite side, there's a shooter. So I think that's why they like to do that. But I do think there are times when the fact that you have two basically, catch and shoot guys, that it does bog it down a little bit, and it does put too much pressure on Xavier. And it's also a function of playing Race at the 4. He's become very good at a lot of things. I think he's the most approved player in the league. Now, when I say that, there's a caveat there, because I don't consider freshmen to sophomores to be eligible for that, so to speak, eligible for that designation, because you're supposed to improve as a freshman to a sophomore. Sometimes your improvement is dictated by minutes, but Race has been, Race played 30 minutes last year. He's playing 30 minutes this year, and he's a much different and better player. I think that's one of the reasons why we've occasionally heard Mike say that he'd like to see Race take more threes, take more jump shots, because it would allow you the freedom to maybe bring in a ball mover like Trey, and not lose that second shooting option. So I totally understand your point, and I agree with it a lot. But I also understand why he likes having the multiple shooters out on the floor, because of what it does. It provides in spacing for Trace and options for him to pass out of the post.
I got two topics I want to ask you, because I'm asked these questions constantly. I've been asked them all season, and I feel like I say the same thing over and over, and Indiana fans maybe want me to say something differently or respond a different way. So I'm going to ask you. The first question is, how important is the starting lineup and who starts each half in general in college basketball, in your opinion? Indiana's had a lot of games where they start slow in the first half, or they'll start slow after halftime, and people will say, well, why doesn't the starting lineup change? And it seems like Indiana's been stuck with this same lineup for the whole season. Obviously, they've had some good wins. They've had some other games, the last two in particular. Obviously, last game is a bit of an exception because of who was available. But you look at the Illinois game in the second half, they only scored 21 points, and they really lacked energy coming out of halftime. Even the Purdue game, they found a way to win, but early in the second half, you're going against a really good Purdue team at home, and Purdue comes storming back and is able to get right back into the game. And I think a lot of people wonder about what impact that has. I'm not just specifically at Indiana. You can comment on that, but just in general, how important do you think it even is who's starting games? And are there many teams who adjust their lineups after halftime? Because that's another thing I've been asked about a lot. Why don't coaches look at who played well in the first half? Like, for example, Rob Finney against Purdue, right? He goes off in the first half, plays really well. Start the second half, he's on the bench, and people are asking why, after a guy goes for 17, I think it was in the first half, is he not starting the second half? What just big picture thoughts do you have on starting lineups and how important they are?
Well, if coaches didn't coach like they coach, citing exactly what you're talking about, then it probably wouldn't matter that much, because you'd be talking about 5 minutes of a 40-minute game. So that's 1/8 of the game. It's probably not that important then, because you might never, if you didn't coach like you coach, you might not ever get back to that combination. But the reality is almost all coaches coach like they coach, which is they send out the same 5 for the first half and the second half. Now you're up to 10 minutes of a 40-minute game. That's a fourth of the game. Damn right it matters. When coaches tell me it doesn't matter, I know they're trying to sell me crap, because I know I can, I'm not a mathematician, and I'm really bad at it. And if I were good at it, maybe I'd be like my brother, who was a chief financial officer for a Fortune 500 company at one point. But I'm not. So, but I can do basic math, and a quarter of a game is a big chunk of the game. So it absolutely matters. And if that group doesn't function well together and the coach doesn't adjust it, then he's throwing away a fourth of the game. the first 5 minutes of a game, although, often aren't super impactful in what you see in the final score. I mean, a lot of times there aren't even that many points scored in the first 5 minutes. Not universally, but there are times when you look up and you look at the 15-minute mark and it's like 8-6 or something. But that second half, those first 5 minutes, how many times have you heard a coach say the first 5 minutes of the second half are set the tone for the whole second half? Well, okay, set a good tone, send out the right five guys. And this is not specific to Indiana, because we just discussed the nature of the lineup for them. Just in general, that those first 5 minutes of the second half are huge, and a fourth of the game is huge. So absolutely, I think it's important. And if someone had someone did a breakdown on what IU does for those first five of each half, and it was substandard, then it would absolutely call for a change. And sometimes that affects player ego, player happiness, that sort of thing. They don't feel comfortable not starting. They feel like it's a slap. So again, that's one more reason why it does matter. So I think there are an abundance of factors that make that an important consideration. And when a coach blows it off, he's either trying to con us, which he's allowed to do, but he's trying to con us, or he's not paying close enough attention to the reality of the situation, the math of those 10 minutes, how important they are, and how important especially it is to come right out of the halftime circumstance and do well.
You live in Indiana. You follow high school basketball in Indiana. You know what was kind of the discussion and the talk about Christian Lander coming into college in terms of his ranking. He was a 5-star recruit. He did move up a class to come to Indiana early. And I think there was, you look at the 5-star recruits that Indiana has signed in the last 10 to 15 years, most of them have turned out to be impactful players, maybe not from a winning standpoint, but statistically they've all, I think for the most part, had, decent to really good careers at times when you look at guys like Cody Zeller and Yogi Ferrell. Lander's impact has really been minimal to this point. You follow, obviously, the Big Ten. These 5-star recruits usually are few and far between, really, coming into Big Ten schools. When you look at McDonald's All-American type players, the Big Ten's not landing these caliber of recruits very often compared to other leagues. How surprised have you been at just the lack of impact with Lander? And is there anything you can tell us in terms of what you think has led to him basically being a fringe rotation player at Indiana almost 2 seasons in?
I think part of it is the injury this year. I think we have to consider the amount of time he missed and how much the team progressed beyond him, and the fact that the decision was made to bring in Xavier Johnson. And from a pure basketball standpoint, I think that decision has been a success. I think he has shown that he is a Big Ten level point guard. And so I understand why they did that. But I can say, Alex, that I'm aware of 3 players who were 5-star level point guard recruits who advanced their graduation and enrolled early. Derek Thornton, who went to Duke late 2016 or mid 2010s is what I'm saying, the midway part of last decade. Then you look at Devin Booker, who went to Kentucky last year and then transferred to Texas. And then you look at Christian. And all 3 of them have struggled well beyond what their talent suggested they should. And, I looked at Derek Thornton, and I was never a huge fan of his talent, but he was really highly regarded. Devin the same way, but Christian's a player who I still see a lot of spark in. When he's on, he's very quick, very dynamic, can create his own shot. So I still see something there. I don't think it's all talent-based with those 3 players. I think that they jumped into a pool that they weren't ready to swim in, and it's been difficult for them as a result. So I think that's where he is now. honestly, given what happened this year and what was in place, this wouldn't have been a bad year to take a redshirt year. Although I don't know if based on COVID, he needs to take a redshirt year. He might not. And that may have been why he didn't. But under ordinary circumstances, I probably would have said to save this year of eligibility, you probably should redshirt. Maybe because of COVID, he doesn't need to, that he'd have 3 years beyond this anyway. I guess that's true. So it didn't hurt him to continue to try to play. But he's behind because of that, and then because of the injury. So the effort for him to catch up involves having a amazing summer, and like putting all the work in that he can possibly put. Not to the point of damaging his body, but following the guidelines that the best players use. And I'm talking about NBA players, elite college players. However much time is you can put on the floor before you get diminishing returns. That's what he should do, because he's got a lot of ground to make up for. But he's still a talented kid. Just look at a film clip of him, any film clip, and you can see the spark there. There's ability there, and I'd hate to see him let it get away.
I mean, if you're looking at this from the, obviously we don't know the inner workings of what's going on behind the scenes. We don't know what his relationship is with the coaching staff. We don't know how happy he has been with his role. We don't know what he wants to do beyond this year. But from an IU perspective, I feel like you have to look at him as, a pretty valuable asset moving forward still, because if you have to replace him in the offseason, obviously they've got, a guard coming in Jalen Hood-Schifino, which more of a combo guy, but I don't know that you're going to go into the transfer portal or find another player with that level of talent. So to me, from an IU perspective, if you think he can work, he's got to be a guy that you want to keep around moving forward after the season, regardless of what he's done so far. Am I wrong in thinking that way?
No, absolutely not. I mean, as I said, I think with a great summer of work, and we've seen lots of players advance themselves significantly with great summers. You look at players like when Ayo Dosunmu is my gold standard for that. Ayo came off of his third year I think it was his second year at Illinois, and had big holes in his game, but obviously had a great ability. Went to work. I believe he worked a lot with his dad, worked tirelessly on his jump shot, and comes back and is a first-team All-American and should have been a first-round pick, but wasn't, but is a highly successful pro as a rookie on a really good team, not just some guy out there getting numbers on a bad team, but getting real minutes on a team that now has serious postseason aspirations. That was all summer work that changed him into the player that he is. I said very good before. So this is a different process. This is going from struggling player to very good player. But if you have the raw material, which he does, which, that he has the ability, Christian does, to turn himself into a really good college player, but it's not going to happen. It's not just going to happen. Oh, okay, those guys are gone now, and so there's minutes. No, it's not about that. It's not about opportunity. It's about being ready to take advantage of that opportunity. And if he does that, when I, if I were having that conversation with him, I'd say, look, I really think you're talented and I want you here. But if you don't want to work, then you probably should play somewhere else, because there are places you could play at this level. I mean, at your current level of production ability, whatever you want to call it, you could play a lot of places and do fine. But at the Big Ten and the level Indiana wants to be, it's going to take significant improvement. And that improvement comes through May to September work.
You said a phrase there when talking about Ayo as a rookie in the NBA. He's not putting up big numbers on a bad team. And it immediately kind of shifted my mind to what I wanted to ask you about next, which is Trace Jackson Davis and his legacy at Indiana. Because you look at what he's done now over 2.5 seasons. He's been Indiana's leading scorer now for 3 straight seasons, but the team's success hasn't been what the program would like it to be. And I feel like this next month and a half or actually month or so now that we have to go until Selection Sunday is pretty important just in terms of how he's going to be looked at and remembered as an IU player. We don't know what's going to happen beyond this year, but if he goes into a situation where he plays in Indiana for 3 years, puts up really good numbers, but never makes the tournament, that's going to be looked upon a lot differently than a guy who stuck it out for 3 years and then the third year was finally rewarded with, an NCAA tournament berth. Right now, I mean, with Trace, I don't think he's going to be a first-team All-Big Ten guy when I look at the list of who's in contention for that. He's put up really good numbers once again, but struggles against, as you mentioned, some of the bigger guys in the Big Ten. Hunter Dickinson outplayed him. Kofi Coburn outplayed him. What does Indiana need from him down the stretch when you look at these last 7 games and in the Big Ten tournament if they're going to get over the hump? And how important is it for him just in terms of how he's viewed as a player, both by Indiana fans and nationally, to win more games and have those numbers be more relevant in terms of being tied to a team that's winning rather than just putting up numbers for a team that's middle of the pack or not making the tournament?
One thing I'd say is that some of that legacy, unfortunately, is impacted by the fact that there was no tournament in 2020. That's his freshman year. They're probably going to make it, especially after they beat Nebraska in the Wednesday night game. And so that goes away and it becomes sort of this hole in a resume. And that hole has existed in several coaches' resumes as well that are no longer working. And we can talk about being close to home here, so there's that. But given where they have been this year and, winning the Purdue game, being very successful over the first half of the Big Ten schedule, albeit not the more challenging portion of their schedule, obviously, but being really successful over the first portion of their schedule, to lose it now would not reflect well on him, even if it's not his fault, so to speak. Tuesday night at Northwestern, he goes for 13 and 11, and he's getting ganged up on defense because Northwestern, they've got good coaches. They know there's 5 guys missing. They've got no real point guard. If we just hold Trace to an inefficient night, then all that has to happen is that our offense has to be functional, and that's what happens. So I think that it's not all on him, but he also needs to be highly productive because this stretch of games that you're playing now that I mentioned as being really challenging. Michigan State, now you've got a great shot blocker in there, but he doesn't play most nights, doesn't play full-time minutes. They keep him to low 20s, if not below, Marcus Bingham. Then you've got Wisconsin, which has 2 very capable big guys, but we're not talking about Hunter Dickinson and Kofi Coburn. Stephen Crowell is a very good player, but not a All-America level player. And then Ohio State, which plays small. I mean, he's looking his assignment Zed Key in the eye that night when it comes around. So you're not having to face the dominant size that has disadvantaged him at times. So I think he's positioned to have a really good run now. As well, and whether or not that produces victories, hard to say, because again, a lot of teams would lose all 3 of Michigan State, Wisconsin, Ohio State. A lot of tournament teams would lose all 3 of those, but they're in a position where they probably can't afford to lose all 3 of them because of the Northwestern loss.
Last thing before we get you out of here, Big Ten Player of the Year race is something I feel like we're going to be talking a lot about over the next couple of weeks. It's pretty fascinating when you look at what's going on at the top of the league. You've got Purdue, Illinois, and Wisconsin all sitting at 10-3, and you look at some of the names associated with those teams. Obviously, Johnny Davis has been terrific for Wisconsin, and somehow. I know this is something you probably had to talk about too. How's Wisconsin a 2 seed with with the Ken Palm ranking and the Sagarin numbers that they have, well, they've won a lot of games. I don't, whether you win by 1 or you win by 20, it still counts as a win. So that's one thing with Wisconsin that really impressed me. I picked him 9th or 10th in the league, and Johnny Davis, to me, he's earned every accolade that he's going to get at the end of the season. And obviously with Purdue, you've got Jaden Ivey and Zach Edey have played really well. I don't, necessarily think those guys are going to win Big Ten Player of the Year. And Kofi at Illinois is definitely in the discussion. And EJ Liddell has been. You look at the Ken Palm race for Big Ten Player of the Year. EJ Liddell's at the top of the list, and they're not too far out of the race either. Just one game behind in the loss column. How does this race right now stack up in your mind? And is this as competitive as a contest for that award as you've seen? I mean, I didn't even mention Keegan Murray at Iowa. I mean, Iowa's faded a little bit, but he's put up terrific numbers too for them. And Trace Jackson Davis, obviously not going to be in the mix, but another player with really good individual numbers. Hunter Dickinson's another one. So you can kind of, I think the first 2 all Big Ten teams are going to be loaded with talent.
And one of the things that's interesting about that all Big Ten team is that the Big Ten has persisted, and all respect for them for doing this, when other conferences have gone to the total cop-out of going to 6, 8, 10 members on their all conference first teams. I find that to be a ridiculous exercise, Alex, because for those of us who vote for various All-America teams, and Sporting News has one of the All-America teams that's in the consensus, how can you have only 5 All-Americans, but there have to be 10 guys on the all West Coast Conference first team? Come on. I mean, it's ridiculous. So I really respect the Big Ten for doing that. And especially in a year like this, when somebody great, probably multiple great players who had great seasons, are going to be on the second team. I have huge respect for that. I think it's interesting. What makes this Player of the Year race really interesting was that you brought up Jaden Ivey's name and then kind of sort of half brushed it aside. And I think that's what kind of makes it interesting, because it's not unfair to do that, but I don't know that it's accurate. When Ivey goes out and does what he did against Illinois on Tuesday, that sort of reinforces my belief that he's the best player in the league. But there have been nights, 15 against Iowa. He's had some games where he was inefficient. The Wisconsin loss where he got blown away by Johnny Davis, both ends of the floor. That sort of sits there too. So it makes it understandable that one might, that he didn't have the momentum that some of the others had. And also he doesn't have the pure counting stats that they do. He's averaging 17.7. And some of the other players are 20 plus. So it's affected his viability for such an award. But I if they continue to do what they've done, I don't think I have a vote for the all Big Ten. I mean, for the Big Ten Player of the Year. I don't think I have one of those, but he's who I would vote for. But Johnny Davis, Johnny had the other night against Michigan State that's right back into his wheelhouse, where he went for 25. He was 8 of 11. That's the first time in a while he's been that efficient. He was he had the Minnesota game that was a couple of weeks ago on BTN, so we did that game, and the last 3 minutes of the game he played like a Player of the Year and took the game over when it could have gone the other way. So even though he's had some rough nights statistically, and especially from a standpoint of, when I say, I'm not a huge efficiency guy when they talk about players, but you don't want to be hanging too many 5 and 19s, 2 and 13s out there. And he's had more than a few since teams started ganging up on him. Kofi, again, unbelievable numbers. But when he met Purdue twice, and I know that's a lot to ask with both of those guys, but one game fouled out only 20 minutes, and then the other game non-factor, played but was controlled. So I think when you have great players like that, it's almost like you look at what they don't do as much as what they do, because what they do is the constant. What they accomplish is the constant. They're almost always great. So where does somebody lose it as much as where does somebody win it? And when you have 4, 5, 6 players who could be in that conversation, I mean, like E.J. Liddell last night, and it wasn't his fault because they didn't throw him the ball on the last 2, 3 possessions, but losing that game was damaging to him in this pursuit, because what they had been was, just getting it done, and him, across the board, points, blocks, rebounds, threes, dunks, everything, but not a lot of spectacle in terms of either their accomplishment in the league or in terms of his, he doesn't hang a lot of huge numbers. It's always 20. It's always 8 rebounds. It's, and then for them to lose last night hurt him. So I think that may be where we go over this last 3 weeks, 4 weeks, wherein those players that I mentioned and one or two others, who loses it as much as who wins it? Or do we get to a point where somebody goes out there and just puts 3 30s in a row out there, and then maybe somebody does win it? I think the former scenario is more likely, that somebody, 1 or 2 guys are just going to, have that 1 night dip, that 2 night dip that in a race like this you can't afford.
I should preface my dismissal of Ivy earlier, or what you called a dismissal of him, with my my thought that Purdue having 3 players could definitely split. And I've followed this long enough to know, Mike, that a lot of times when this voting happens, you can see certain players that are on the same team, if they're that impactful, splitting the vote. And so that's not to say that I don't think Jaden Ivey's the best player in the Big Ten. I definitely, if I was building a team, he would be among the maybe the first player I would take or the second player I would take. But when you look at just the individual race for it, I think people view, right or wrong, they look at Purdue as more of a 3-headed monster, where they look at Wisconsin as Johnny Davis had to go into Mackey and score 39 and whatever it was for them to win that game. It was 37, 39 or whatever. So I think, I'm trying to look at maybe what the voters would do as opposed to what they should do.
Yeah, I apologize if I characterized it as that. I didn't mean to imply that you didn't recognize his value. I was just sort of trying to set up the dichotomy of you thinking he wouldn't win it and me thinking if I could vote, that's who I'd vote. And the point being that there are so many viable candidates that are so impactful that you could see where 2 people could look at it and say, like you said, 3-headed monster, I can't vote for Jaden Ivey. Johnny Davis is by far his team's best player, so he deserves it. And that's a reasonable position on both ends. Follow
him on Twitter at TSN Mike. He's in studio for the Big Ten Network on Sundays. He's also a bracketologist. He's the world's greatest Liverpool fan. He's doing a little bit of everything. I hear him on the radio down here in Louisville every week talking college hoops. I know he's on the radio all over the country. So, Mike, thanks for carving out the time for us. You're somebody that, like I've told you this before, I read your columns when my dad used to get the sporting news growing up. I remember there was Mike DeCourcy. I know, our family thinks a lot of you, and we appreciate you taking the time today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Alex. Always a delight.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to this week's show. If you enjoyed it, please leave us a review on iTunes or Spotify, and we'll be back again next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.